On the morning of July 26, 1956, people turned on their television sets to stunning news. The previous night, the Swedish liner Stockholm had rammed the Andrea Doria just off Nantucket Island. The images were shocking, stark, unbelievable. The great liner on her side in the Atlantic abandoned as the ocean slowly but surely took possession. It was the first time that a maritime tragedy had played out before millions of eyes on television. Over the next few days, viewers saw heart-rending scenes of survivors arriving in New York as they pushed past cameras and microphones for emotional reunions with desperate relatives. There were tales of heroism and allegations of cowardice, of joy, and of loss, and above all, a sense of disbelief that a tragedy like that which had befallen Titanic could occur in the modern age. But icebergs, as Doria's passengers had discovered, could take many shapes. This is a passage from The Last Voyage of the Andrea Doria by Greg King and Penny Wilson. The story of the Andrea Doria, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello, and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures. Thank you so much for listening and continuing to support the podcast. Today's story is fairly well known. As mentioned, the sinking of the Andrea Doria played out on television for everyone to see. But there is more to the story than just the headlines. So let's dive in. We start in post-World War II Italy, and the mood was far from cheery. Italy had been thoroughly beaten, battered, and occupied. 500,000 Italians died during the war, and the country lost virtually their entire navy, which had been formidable. Only 2 modern ships were still in service at the end of the war, and those went to the United States and United Kingdom as spoils of war, which were soon given back to Italy and scrapped for metal. By the end of the war, Italy had also lost 90% of its merchant vessels. Italy's previous badge of maritime honor was the Rex, which had won the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic given to the liner that crossed the Atlantic with the fastest average speed. But like the rest of Italy's ships, the Rex was lost in the destruction of war. Italy desperately needed something to boost their national pride. Named after a 16th century Genoese general, the Andrea Doria was built using ingenuity and resourcefulness. Using scrap metal from the many destroyed ships in its waters, the new ship would be built to accommodate the increasingly popular pleasure cruise industry, with a focus on luxury. Owned by the Italian line, which was a partly state-owned operation, the Andrea Doria would not be the biggest or even the fastest ship, but no expense was spared to make it the most luxurious. Professional scuba diver, author, and journalist Andrea Murdock Alpini explains why the Andrea Doria was so important to Italians.
Andrea Doria was the best ever ship that Italy had, and during the 50s was a really masterpiece, a floating masterpiece. Andrea Doria has a link with our past as Italian, but at the same time looking forward to our future.
She was adorned with elegant furniture, contemporary architecture, mosaics, countless works of art, the latest technology, air conditioning, and gorgeous, comfortable staterooms. The best artisans, engineers, and architects were employed to make her truly one of a kind. The first-class cabins were as beautiful and luxurious as the most expensive hotel suites. She was so impressive that people changed their travel plans to book passage on the luxury liner. It was a dream come true, said Third Officer Eugenio Giannini. It was amazing to serve on the Andrea Doria because it was the most beautiful ship in the world. The Italian line released a statement that the Andrea Doria was a living testament to the importance of beauty in the everyday world. At 702 feet long and 90 feet wide, It had capacity for 218 first-class passengers, 320 cabin-class passengers, 703 tourist-class passengers, and 563 crew. Her hull was painted a sleek black with white trim, with accent colors of red, green, and white. While beautiful, she was also built with a focus on safety. Built with 11 watertight bulkheads and fitted with a double hull, the ship was considered one of the safest on the waters at the time. The Andrea Doria was built for transatlantic crossing between Genoa and New York City. Her maiden transatlantic voyage in January of 1953 turned out to be quite a celebratory affair. Large, cheering, and flag-waving crowds came to see off the joyful and excited passengers. She would make stops in Cannes, Naples, and Gibraltar before heading across the Atlantic, eager to show off the new gleaming pride of Italy. By 1956, the Andrea Doria had made 100 trips across the Atlantic and earned a worldwide reputation for being a first-class cruise liner. The ship was a favorite of celebrities at the time, including Kim Novak, Orson Welles, and Cary Grant. The captain of the Andrea Doria was Piero Calamai. He was an experienced mariner, having served in the Italian Royal Navy with distinction in World War I and World War II. After World War II, he continued as a merchant marine captain prior to being named the captain of the Andrea Doria with the Italian line. Calamai was involved with the ship almost from the very beginning, participating in its trial runs, and had commanded all of her voyages since its maiden voyage in 1953. On July 17, 1956, the Andrea Doria left Genoa on his 101st voyage across the Atlantic. Calamai was open about his belief that this would be his last voyage on the Andrea Doria, as he was scheduled to take command of the Doria's sister ship, the Cristoforo Colombo, upon his return to Genoa. After making its customary stops at Cannes, Naples, and Gibraltar, she took a southern route across the Atlantic, which was warmer and typically offered calmer seas. All three classes of passengers would enjoy swimming pools, sun-soaked afternoons, movie theaters, live orchestras, exquisite food, and games on the main deck. The 1,134 passengers included celebrities, tourists, and Italian immigrants heading for the United States. Ironically, all the staterooms had a copy of the recently published book, A Night to Remember, which detailed the tragedy of the HMS Titanic. But it was summer, it was warm, and there would be no icebergs. After all, the ship had all the latest technology and modern safety features. There wasn't any reason for concern. But passenger Lilian Aduna had an ominous premonition. I dreamt that my daughter and I weren't on the Andrea Doria, but on the Cape Ann, and I saw the Andrea Doria sink. When I went to breakfast, I told my friends that I didn't feel like eating because I dreamt the Andrea Doria had sunk. They laughed. They said it couldn't happen with modern technology. Additionally, the conditions along the normally pleasant route were less than ideal. Second engineer Giovanni Cordera said, "Although it was July, a favorable season, we had fog quite often after passing Gibraltar. A calm sea, but a lot of fog. Indeed, on this voyage, the Atlantic would not cooperate." The ship soon encountered violent storms and rough seas that shook the ship and tossed the passengers around in their cabins. Seasickness was rampant. A passenger named Adalgisa de Fabio recalled, "I was so sick that I couldn't even get off my berth. The rolling seemed like it would never stop." To the credit of the captain and crew, the Andrea Doria pushed on, keeping its passengers safe, despite being jostled about. A week later, on July 24th, the ship finally found calmer seas and the passengers resumed socializing, playing games, attending concerts, and other activities. With only 2 more days at sea, and perhaps feeling a bit guilty about the extended passage through the violent seas, Captain Calamai rescheduled the captain's ball to be held a day earlier. It was a glamorous affair. On the morning of the 25th, the Andrea Doria was just 1 day out from New York City, and the weather was clear. The storms that pestered the ship for the past few days had passed. The passengers had 1 more full day on board to enjoy the ship's luxuries. The mood was light and a bit wistful as the trip was winding down. Earlier that morning, a shipwide announcement was made. Passengers are requested to have their baggage ready today at 3:30. At that time, the cabin personnel will begin the transportation of the baggage from the cabins to the promenade deck to facilitate disembarkation. Tomorrow, passengers will find their baggage on the pier under the initials of their names. The rest of the afternoon was largely spent packing and preparing for their scheduled 6:30 a.m. arrival in New York. Meanwhile, also on the 25th, at 11:30 a.m., the ship MV Stockholm was leaving New York Harbor on its way to Gothenburg, Sweden. The Stockholm was a small mixed cargo and passenger liner of the Swedish-American line. At just 524 feet, she was in fact the smallest passenger vessel making the Atlantic crossing at the time. The Stockholm was not a glamorous ship, being more practical than beautiful. But the Swedish ship had a reinforced steel bow in order to break through the icy waters of the North Atlantic and Baltic Sea. The Stockholm carried 534 passengers, 208 crew, and was captained by Henry Gunnar Nordenson. The 63-year-old captain was American-born to Swedish parents and studied at the Swedish Navigational College, obtaining his ship's master license in 1920. The experienced captain was known to be strict and aloof, and kept matters to the business at hand. By mid-afternoon, on the 25th, the Andrea Doria was approaching the waters off Nantucket Sound, which is the busiest shipping lane in the North Atlantic, often referred to as the Times Square of the Atlantic. As she got closer to the northeast coast of the United States, she began to experience a light fog. But this light fog thickened quickly, only clearing occasionally. Second Officer Guido Baudano said later, "You often get fog approaching the continental shelf. We came across it that day at 3 in the afternoon. Between 2 and 4 p.m., the fog changed from a thin wisp to being so thick the water couldn't be seen from the cabin windows." Passenger Barbara Bliss later recalled, "The air was chilly and wet on our faces. It was barely possible to see the person standing 2 feet away." Her stepfather, Robert Boggs, happened to be a retired vice admiral in the United States Navy, and he arranged a tour of the bridge. Barbara recalls the crew on the bridge huddled around the ship's radar since visibility was so poor. When they returned back down to the passenger deck, Boggs commented to her, "In this kind of fog, this damn ship is going much too fast. The captain's trying to make time and stay on schedule. We're going to hit another ship." Some passengers recalled they could not see from one side of the ship to the other, and openly questioned crew members about the speed of the ship, but they were assured all was fine and there was nothing to worry about. But Captain Calamai had indeed taken some precautions to combat the fog. He posted a lookout to monitor the ship's radar, and had been sounding the foghorn every 100 seconds. He also reduced the ship speed slightly from 23 to 21.8 knots, ordered all 12 watertight compartments to be closed and sealed, and an additional lookout was also posted on the bow. "That famous afternoon, we were sailing under fog alert," said Second Engineer Cordera. "That meant extra watches, reducing boiler pressure, and being ready to stop suddenly if we got the order to stop or reduce speed." Whether or not Captain Calamai reduced the ship's speed adequately is a matter of debate. International regulations at the time stated, "Every vessel shall, in fog, mist, falling snow, heavy rainstorms, or any other conditions similarly restricting visibility, go at a moderate speed, having careful regard to the existing circumstances and conditions." Captains were expected to reduce speed in order to stop in half the distance of their visibility. With visibility at virtually zero, this meant the ship would have had to stop completely. While he disobeyed this regulation, in his defense, it was common practice to ignore this regulation. Captain Calamai was well aware that a late arrival would cost the Italian line money. The captain relied heavily on his radar, and along with the other precautions, he remained confident that all was well. Throughout the night, the ship's foghorn could be heard signaling its presence to other ships in the heavy fog. Passengers who wandered out on the deck noticed they could no longer see the water. Passenger Robert Young exclaimed, "If they don't slow this thing down in a fog like this, something is going to happen." But the majority aboard passed the time dining, playing cards, dancing, and saying goodbye to each other. Many retired early, knowing the ship would be arriving in New York in the early morning. Others enjoyed a later night, continuing to dance, drink, and get the most out of their trip. Everyone expected to be in port by morning. On the Stockholm, Captain Nordenson was pushing on, traveling east along the coast of Long Island as usual. His course was a bit of a shortcut, meant to shave off a little time, and was a route he had taken many times before. However, it was not the recommended route, and the Stockholm was traveling 20 miles north of the route reserved for eastbound ships. The Stockholm was, in fact, traveling in the lane reserved for westbound traffic, in violation of the regulations that the Swedish American line had agreed to. Back on the Andrea Doria, Captain Calamai steadfastly remained on the bridge, refusing to be relieved, determined to guide his ship through the heavy fog. When other officers were relieved, he stayed on the bridge. Navigating through the fog proved to be difficult, with visibility so poor he could just barely see the bow at times. Because the radar was so critical for guiding the ship, he ordered a backup radar system turned on and monitored at all times by Junior Third Officer Eugenio Giannini. Shortly after 9 p.m., Giannini spotted something on the radar, and it was estimated to be approximately 12 miles away. After some calculations, it was determined this signal was the Nantucket Lightship. This was a ship that was permanently anchored and provided a light signal for inbound and outbound ships to help guide them through the busy shipping channel. Located off the rocky coast of Nantucket Island, the lightship provided a method for ships' captains to determine their own location. At exactly 10:45 p.m., we spotted a radar signal at 17 miles, said Giannini, 4 degrees to starboard. It was clear the ship was coming toward us on a parallel route, and that it would pass us to starboard at a distance of about 1.2 or 1.3 miles. Senior Officer Curzio Franchini was troubled by this, stating, "I think it is unusual for a ship to be coming eastbound in these waters." Indeed, it was. Recall that Captain Nordenson was 20 miles north of the recommended route. Those same regulations dictated that 2 ships approaching each other on a collision course in clear water are mandated to veer starboard for a port-to-port passing. But the weather was not clear, and Calamai believed the oncoming vessel was a fishing boat heading to Nantucket Island. He decided it would endanger both ships to attempt a port-to-port passing, as this would cause the ships to cross each other's path. If both ships stayed on their current course, they would pass each other at a suitable distance. In addition, turning starboard toward the Nantucket Lightship and the dangerous rocky shoals was something he did not wish to do. On the Stockholm, Captain Nordenson realized he was too far north, and his course would take the ship north of the Nantucket Lightship. He ordered a turn to starboard to pass south of the lightship, and at full speed. After issuing this order, Nordenson retired for the night, leaving Third Officer Johan Ernst Carstens Johansson at the helm, but left a standing order to stay 1 mile away from passing ships and to wake him immediately if the ship encountered fog. Carstens Johansson was a fairly young officer at the time, and this would be his first ever sole command of a ship. The Swedish American line did not require 2 officers to be on the bridge at all times, and Carstens Johansson was responsible for navigating the ship, monitoring the radar, and other duties. There were 3 other crew present, but they were not officers. The chart room was behind the bridge and required Carstens Johansson to leave the bridge in charge of these other crew members while he was gone. In normal circumstances, this would not be regarded as significant, but in heavy fog or any kind of inclement weather or distress, this can be disastrous. There is no substitute for the knowledge and experience of a veteran ship captain in these situations. Carstens Johansson reported that he received radio signals from Block Island and Nantucket Island. The Nantucket Lightship was sending a signal of 4 long dashes a minute, followed by 2 minutes of silence, which is the signal warning for dense fog. Seemingly, the young officer either ignored or misunderstood this signal. Being unaware of the fog warning, Captain Nordenson was not awakened. By about 10:40 p.m., one of the other seamen on the Stockholm, named Peter Larsson, had taken the helm of the Stockholm. Carstens Johansson took over monitoring the radar system, which he was not familiar with. He had only recently joined the Stockholm and had not been fully trained on the ship's radar system. Specifically, he had trouble properly adjusting the brightness of the radar screen. Meanwhile, Larsen proved to be a very poor helmsman, repeatedly veering to port then back to starboard, and he simply could not maintain a steady course. At approximately 11 p.m., according to Carstens Johansson, the Stockholm picked up a radar signal which he estimated to be about 12 miles off, but he evaluated the situation much differently than his counterpart, Captain Calamai. In his estimation, the ships would pass port to port within about a half mile of each other. Very close, but in his mind, the ships would pass each other safely. This was a direct violation of Captain Nordenson's standing order that the Stockholm should always pass at least a mile from another ship. For an unknown reason, be it pride, hubris, anxiety, or something else, Carstens Johansson ignored this order. Carstens Johansson attempted to locate the oncoming ship visually, using his binoculars, but could not. The dense heavy fog was preventing him from seeing anything, but still Captain Nordenson was not awakened. The Stockholm's speed was not reduced and pushed ahead at full speed through the dense fog. The ships were at this time about 5 miles away from each other, and neither knew the intentions of the other. Soon, a lookout on the Stockholm was able to make out a red light of an approaching ship, and Carstens Johansson ordered a 22-degree turn to starboard, in hopes of putting some distance between the Stockholm and the Andrea Doria. But he made yet another mistake by failing to blow the ship's whistle, which indicates a change in course as per regulations. Andrea Doria officer Giannini said, "I went to the wing of the bridge to try to hear the fog signals that a ship sailing in fog must emit." Neither Giannini nor Calamai heard or saw any warnings of the approaching Stockholm. "At a certain point, we should have heard signals," said Giannini. "Not hearing them, I went to look in the direction of the signal and tried to see the ship through the binoculars." At this time, Captain Calamai was still on the bridge of the Andrea Doria, diligently watching the radar and monitoring the approaching ship. He believed this mystery ship would pass the Doria approximately a mile to the starboard side. At 11:10, almost exactly at the same time the Stockholm had turned south, Calamai ordered the Doria to turn to port, which was also south, to increase the distance between the ships. A few minutes later, the crew aboard the Andrea Doria started reporting faint lights off his starboard side. Calamai saw these lights too, and he believed the ship would soon turn to port to pass safely, but there was no change in course. The Stockholm also never sounded the ship's horn. Third Officer Giannini had been carefully studying the ship's lights aboard the Stockholm when he noticed he could now clearly see the red light on the bow indicating its port side. And just as an aside, a ship's starboard side displays a green light, and the port side displays a red light. Giannini knew what this meant. The Stockholm had indeed turned, but not to port. It had turned to starboard and was heading directly at the Andrea Doria. By this time, the ships were just a mile away from each other. While neither ship was as big as a freighter, both required some distance to maneuver. Pinpoint turns were not possible. Calamai saw the ship coming straight for the Andrea Doria, and his only option was to continue to turn to port. Calamai would later say, "We saw that the ship was swinging to her starboard, heading toward us. Because the other ship was definitely turning to starboard, any turn by us to that side would have been unavailing and more dangerous." As the crew on the Andrea Doria sprung into action, Calamai ordered the Doria hard to port. Her only hope would be to outrun the Stockholm. Calamai ordered the ship to sound its siren 2 times, as the ship desperately tried to outmaneuver the oncoming ship. The crew could see the Stockholm still coming straight for her, at full speed, sounding no warnings and making no effort to change its course. Just a minute later, at 11:11 p.m., the Stockholm smashed into the starboard side of the Andrea Doria at almost a 90-degree angle. The Andrea Doria's hull was ripped open by the reinforced bow of the Stockholm, puncturing deep into the ship and then scraping and grinding its way down the side of the ship. Passengers were jolted awake by the terrible sounds of screeching metal and screaming. The friction of the scraping metal caused the insulation of the ship's hull to catch fire, causing the ship's sprinkler system to engage. The burning hull produced noxious fumes which permeated all throughout the ship. Screams could be heard all around. Passengers were confused and panicked, and the crew scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. Some were killed instantly by the massive collision. The Stockholm punctured the Andrea Doria roughly amidships, smashing through the double hull, directly hitting cabins 52, 54, and 56 on the upper deck, and penetrating 40 feet deep. Many passenger cabins were destroyed while still occupied, hurling its occupants into the mangled mess of debris. 3 out of 5 of the watertight compartments were gashed, and 5 fuel tanks were ripped open and filled with seawater. The Stockholm's bow cut a hole down the starboard side of the Andrea Doria like a can opener. This caused the Andrea Doria a rapid and uncontrollable list to the starboard side. With the Stockholm's bow stuck in the Doria's hull, the two ships continued on for about 30 seconds. Full stop was ordered on the Stockholm, and then full astern. She slowly pulled away, dislodging herself from the Andrea Doria, scraping and grinding its twisted metal, making a terrifying sound. At 11:22 p.m., a radio message sent by the Stockholm was received by the United States Coast Guard in Long Island. "We have collided with another ship. Please, ship in collision." The Andrea Doria also sent a distress call. Now, both captains knew the identity of the other ship. "19-year-old American Jermaine D'Onofrio was returning home to Detroit after vacationing in Italy, and she and her friends were watching a movie in the dining hall at the time of the accident. Everything was falling all over people. We weren't able to walk. We left the dining hall and we noticed that people were coming up from the lower decks," said D'Onofrio. Passengers were streaming up from the lower decks, trying to escape the water and acrid smoke. Personal belongings, equipment from the ship, furniture, luggage, and other items could be seen floating in the water around the ship. Another survivor, Pierrette Simpson, recalls, "I remember the traumatic parts, the chaos, the noise, people screaming, and the lights going on and off. We weren't able to stand because of the steep incline, first to the left and then back to the right. People were hurt and crying and calling out names to find family members." Pat Mastrancola, a young boy at the time, recalled later, "I was lucky because being a boy, I could sneak right between the door and a pile of people and I got out. When I got near the cabin area, the people below me on B and C deck had drowned and you could hear screaming." Mastrancola was able to reach his sister's cabin, who was amazingly still asleep. He woke her up and dragged her to safety. In the middle deck, Ferdinand Melli Darrow and Francis de Figaro Darrow were killed when their cabins suffered a direct hit. Their son, 13-year-old Peter, survived. One of the most memorable stories of survival was that of a 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan, who was traveling to New York on vacation with her family. She was catapulted from her cabin when the ships collided, and presumed dead. Linda's father, Edward P. Morgan, a famous television personality, was preparing for a broadcast when he was told that his daughter had died in the collision. But Linda was found alive in the mangled bow of the Stockholm, where she was rescued by the ship's crew. The stunned girl asked, "I was on the Andrea Doria. Where am I now?" Sadly, the impact killed her stepfather, Camille Cianfara, and her half-sister, Joan Cianfara. Her mother, Jane, was severely injured, but she survived the ordeal. Those in the dining hall prayed together and formed a human chain as they struggled through the debris. Terrified passengers frantically crawled, scrambled, and groped their way to the port side rail, waiting for a chance to get into a lifeboat. The ship was now badly listing, and finding footing on the sloped and slippery deck was difficult. The crew of the Andrea Doria quickly realized the lifeboats on the port side were at such an angle now, due to the ship's listing, that they could not be lowered. Calamai knew he didn't have enough lifeboats for all the passengers, so he radioed again. "Here, danger immediate. Need lifeboats, as many as possible. Can't use our lifeboats." The Andrea Doria's crew heroically launched the starboard side lifeboats and began boarding passengers as quickly as possible. The French ship Ile-de-France received the distress call and was on her way, but it would take nearly 4 hours for her to arrive at the scene. The Stockholm's bow was very badly damaged, but the ship was in no danger of sinking. After recovering from the jolt, the crew of the Stockholm launched its lifeboats and began rescuing passengers. The first ship to respond to the distress call was the small freighter Cape Ann. 2 U.S. Navy ships arrived shortly after, but there were still not enough lifeboats. At 2:30 a.m., the Ile-de-France arrived, earlier than expected. Captain Raoul de Baudon very skillfully maneuvered his ship between the rescue ships, without jeopardizing the survivors. The French ship flooded the area with its lights and shuttled its 10 lifeboats back and forth. The crew of the Andrea Doria and many brave passengers acted heroically, lowering passengers down to lifeboats on ropes. The rescue went on for several hours, and by 5:30 a.m., nearly all the survivors were rescued. In total, 1,663 people were rescued, including passengers and crew. 753 were put on board the Ile-de-France, 545 aboard the Stockholm, 129 on the Cape Ann, 159 on the United States naval ship Private William H. Thomas, and 77 on the USS Edward H. Allen. Captain Calamai was determined to stay on board until everyone else was off. "We got into a lifeboat, but Captain Calamai stayed on board," said Giannini. "He said, 'Row away, but not too far. I'll join you at the last minute.'" At 5:30 a.m., once all the passengers were rescued, he was convinced to board the last lifeboat. 46 passengers on the Andrea Doria and 5 crew members aboard the Stockholm sadly lost their lives. It is a magnificent feat of heroism that prevented more from dying on that foggy night in the North Atlantic. At 10:09 a.m., the Andrea Doria rolled over and plunged to its watery grave. In the wake of the disaster, investigations began as the Italian line and Swedish American line both looked for answers. The Italian line ordered its employees not to talk to the press. However, the Swedish American line employees did talk, and claimed the Andrea Doria suffered from defects in its design. Lawyers and public relations specialists got to work pointing blame. The media largely blamed the Italians, with a tinge of anti-Italian sentiment and a lingering distrust of the Italians following World War II. As tensions mounted, both companies accused the other of wrongdoing. However, both sides wanted to limit liability to the value of the ships after the accident. That would be the damaged but serviceable Stockholm at $3 million, and the lifeboats and ticket revenue from the Andrea Doria valued at $400,000. Preliminary hearings began in New York, causing a media frenzy. The Italians claimed that the Stockholm made a sudden and irresponsible maneuver and rammed the Andrea Doria. The Swedes claimed the Andrea Doria changed its position and cut across the Stockholm's path. An interesting note here is that the Italians claim the Stockholm was on a parallel course to the north of the Andrea Doria. However, the Swedes claim the Stockholm was to the south of the Italian ship. Somebody must have misread their radar. Was it the officers on the bridge of the Andrea Doria, including Captain Calamai? Or was it the young and inexperienced Karstens Johansson aboard the Stockholm, who was the only officer on the bridge? There were also questions about the speed of the ships, and even whether or not there had been dense fog. The lawyer for the Andrea Doria offered an out-of-court settlement to the Stockholm's lawyer, but it was dismissed by the Swedes. According to his client and eyewitness, Karstens Johansson, there was no fog on the night of the collision, which explained why the Stockholm did not reduce its speed or blow its whistle. A rather nasty and aggressive hearing ensued. While on the stand, Captain Nordenson fainted and had to be taken to a nearby hospital. Karstens Johansson took the stand and testified that the Andrea Doria turned south to the port side and cut across the path of the Stockholm. He also claimed there was never any fog, which contradicts the records of all the other ships in the area at the time and the Nantucket lightship, which all confirmed that there was indeed fog in the area at the time on that night. In addition, the Stockholm's own logbooks have 60 references to fog. Lawyers for the Swedish American line also accused Calamai of traveling too fast. The Andrea Doria did reduce its speed, but not by much, and maybe not sufficiently. Eugenio Giannini later said about Calamai, "I never saw him lose his temper during the months I served under him. I always saw him judge things calmly, with ability and good sense." Neither side could prove any negligence with radar navigation or calculations. Karstens Johansson claimed he had plotted the courses of the ships 2 times, based on their radar readings. But his records were lost and his claims could not be substantiated. The testimony of eyewitnesses showed that many mistakes were made by the crews of both ships, and the media pounced. Both companies took a beating in the newspapers. As a result, many more claims were filed by third parties seeking damages from the accident. Lloyd's of London happened to be the insurance company for both the Italian line and the Swedish American line. Seeing the situation getting out of hand, they jumped in before the hearing was over to arbitrate a settlement. Both parties agreed to hold the other party blameless, and a $6 million fund was set up to settle all claims, which was significantly less than the $116 million that had been claimed thus far. The hearing was dropped, and according to Gianelli, the chapter was closed. The Stockholm was towed by tugboats into New York Harbor for repairs totaling $1 million. She continued her usual route for the Swedish American line until 1959, when she was sold to an East German company and renamed the Vogelfreundschaft. In 1983, she was rammed by a West German submarine and badly damaged. After repairs, she was sold and renamed numerous times in 15 years. In 1983, she was attacked by pirates off the coast of Yemen, although there was no damage and nobody was injured. She is still operating as of 2022 as the MV Azores, operating under Portuguese license. The Swedish American line gave Captain Harry Gunnar Nordenson command of its new flagship, the Gripsholm, in 1957, and Third Officer Karstens Johansson joined him. However, there would be a bit of a controversy around this new ship. It was built in the same shipyard in Genoa that built the Andrea Doria. When Nordenson and Karstens Johansson arrived in Genoa to take command of the ship, the workers staged an uprising, refusing to hand the ship over to the two men that they believed destroyed their beloved Andrea Doria. The Swedish American line resolved this issue by sending another captain. Nordenson soon retired from the Swedish American line, and he died in 1981. Karstens Johansson continued his career at sea until 1965. For the rest of his life, he refused to accept any blame for the tragedy. He maintained there was never any fog and that Captain Calamai never should have turned to port, saying, "I did what I did and I know it is right, so I have no problem with it, but it is something you never forget because I have to live with it all my life." He continued, "I can claim with a clear conscience that I have never lain awake at night agonizing over what happened." Karstens Johansson lived a quiet life in Sweden until his death in 2007. Captain Piero Calamai would never again command a ship, and the company parted ways with him soon after. For the remainder of his life, he struggled with the ghosts of the Andrea Doria. According to his daughter, he acted, quote, as a man who has lost a son. Second Officer Guido Badona described Calamai as alone, unsupported, and wronged by the media and his people. He became depressed and unwilling to confront unreasonable questioning. Calamai's last words before passing away in 1972 were, "Are all the passengers saved?" Among the survivors were Lilian Aduna and her daughter Maria. Just as Lilian had dreamt, they were rescued by the Cape Ann. Pat Mastrancola, who rescued his sleeping sister Arlene and their mother Rose, survived the ordeal. Survivor Anthony Grillo organized reunions on Long Island every year for the survivors of the Andrea Doria until 2002. He passed away in 2004, but his sister Vivian has maintained his website at andreadoria.org. Captain Robert Murn, Professor Emeritus of the United States Merchant Marine Academy, later investigated the accident, and he presented his findings in 2001 at the 45th reunion of the ship's survivors. He pored over the ship's records, radar readings, and course recorders of the two ships. "This has been called a mystery, but it really isn't," Murn stated. "It was human error. Karstens Johansson miscalculated the distance between the two ships." According to Murn, the account presented by the Swedish liner's lawyer would have required the Stockholm to be traveling at 2,500 miles per hour, which of course is impossible. His findings indicated that Karstens Johansson judged the distance to the Andrea Doria to be 12 miles, when it was actually 6 miles. His turn to starboard put the Stockholm directly on a collision course with the Andrea Doria. Despite the unfortunate loss of life, the crews aboard both the Andrea Doria and Stockholm acted bravely and responsibly to save the vast majority of the passengers. The Andrea Doria lies on the bottom of the North Atlantic, off the coast of Nantucket Island, about 250 feet or about 75 meters below the surface. The ship's hull, safety nets, and propeller are distinctly still visible. It is an extremely technical and dangerous dive, meant only for trained experts. As of 2022, 22 scuba divers have died attempting to search the wreck of the Andrea Doria. Andrea Murdock Alpini has twice made the difficult dive to explore the Andrea Doria aboard the dive vessel Tenacious.
The first off is the distance from the shore, because we have approximately 45 miles from Nantucket Island and more than 100 miles from Long Island. But the second most tough point that we have during the dive was the current, because we have very strong and very tough and turbulent current on the wrecks, but especially from surface till the bottom. Current is so strong that sometimes it becomes very dangerous, because the wreck in some part is really broken, and also because the wreck is going to collapsing on itself. You cannot control every times where you are going to, because the current can push you up or can you push you down. Sometimes also visibility is not very good on the wreck. On my second dive, for example, I had a very poor visibility. It means around 5-6 feet maximum. But when I dived again on the second day, the visibility was incredibly clean, and had the chance to film the propeller. So I was really amazed. And I really think this Andrea Doria needs to be carefully planned as a dive. You have to pay attention to each kind of details, and you have to be a very talented and skilled divers, especially if you dive in open circuit. But even if you're going to dive in a CCR, with a rebreather, you have to plan anyway carefully, because Andrea Doria is a dream for most part of divers all over the world. But everybody knows that the Andrea Doria is known as the Everest, the Mount Everest of scuba diving. So everyone has to pay attention during his dive on this amazing wreck.
Some divers who have successfully reached the ghostly wreck of the Andrea Doria have, perhaps controversially to some, taken souvenirs from the wreck.
As an Italian, sometimes it's strange to me when I heard or when I see people that are removing artifacts from the wreck, not only from the Andrea Doria's wreck, but from all over wrecks. Because in Italian is very linked and is very merged with his past and his history. In the end, we think that all the stuff that belongs to our past makes the heritage of our country. But later, I dove the Doria is completely different. We have a lot of stories and tales that can be told all over the world, and they can be spread, written, or filmed on the wrecks. And each artifact that is recovered from the wreck, it represents itself in the end a part of our country. The Andrea Doria is going to disappear from the seabed. Currents are destroying, and especially this well during the winter times are destroying the wrecks as well. We should protect probably some part for the memory of the people who died. The wrecks nowadays is a kind of graveyard for people who died during the sinking, but in the end is a graveyard for the ship itself. So we should protect some part, of course. If we allowed divers to dive, it's a different way to protect the wreck itself. Because in this case, we can have stories and tales that can be told. It's another way to preserve the memory of the Andrea Doria as a really amazing and beautiful ship that sunk in 1956.
That brings the story of the Andrea Doria to a close. I want to give a special thank you to Andrea Murdock Alpini for being part of this episode from his home in Italy. His work as a wreck diver and researcher, as well as his articles and books, provide beautiful descriptions of his dives, stunning photographs and videos, to help keep the memory of the Andrea Doria alive. You can find Andrea on Facebook and also on his websites, phidiving.com, that's PHIDIVING.com, and wreckdiving.it. Please visit this episode's show notes on shipwrecksandseadogs.com for the links. Thank you so much to you, our listeners. Your support literally means everything. If you haven't already, please remember to subscribe or follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the show, please leave a 5-star rating and review. If you can't rate or review in your podcast app, head over to podchaser.com. Last but not least, tell a friend. Thank you to Sean Siegfried for writing our outstanding original theme music. You can follow his YouTube channel at Sean Secret. And please follow Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ShipwrecksPod. Lastly, remember to please help preserve the world's oceans by limiting your use of plastics. It's time to cut and run. Until next time, may the wind fill your sails.